Hello and welcome to the channel. Today we are going to be rating Dragonflight Season 1 Mythic Plus Dungeons. This is going to be based on difficulty and fun and somewhat repeatability, whether or not the dungeon is fun to repeat and do multiple times or not. So let's get started. Academy. So when the season of Dragonflight first started, I really thought Academy was going to be one of those keys that was really free and was going to be a really fun time. But as the season went on and everyone started doing higher keys, it really is not one of the free keys. Definitely not. It is definitely one of the harder keys, even on Fortified. Although Fortified, I would argue, is the easier week because the bosses are the main issue. I still think Academy is a pretty difficult key. And for me personally, on Tyrannical, I really don't find the dungeon that fun. And I've done this key so many times trying to push IO. It also makes it not fun for me. But I know it is a pretty decent dungeon for a lot of people. It has a lot of ads and a lot of padding, so I think that is enjoyable for most people. So I'm gonna put it at a B overall. I think it could use some improvement for the bosses. I think Croth and Vex still need to be nerfed. Like they really hurt. Croth not so much as Vex. The mana bombs really hurt a lot of classes, and some classes just don't have the defenses for it on Tyrannical, and they need externals, and it's just not optimal for hugging. It just makes it really difficult to do that key for certain classes on Tyran Week. And like I said, I like it because it's easy to pad on. It's fun to pad on, especially on Fortified. But it's not super fun, not super amazing, just because how many times I've done it, and some of the content in that dungeon is kind of boring and not the greatest in my opinion. Moving on, Azure Vault is the complete opposite. At the beginning of the season, it was very difficult, and a lot of high keys weren't being done. Although there weren't a ton of nerfs to this key, the nerfs that were made were very impactful, and also people discovered better routes. One of my favorite routes of all time in this dungeon is doing the frog skip. At this point in the season, I just feel like it's troll not to do the frog skip. Like if you're doing frogs, I feel like that's really bad and a waste of time. That's just my personal opinion. Although I know for a lot of high keys, like 25s and higher, especially at Fortified, they'll still do frogs, which I guess if it works for them, it works. But for me, I personally do not like doing the frogs. Um, but like I said, the nerfs that were made in this dungeon were impactful. The two that really stick out for me were the third boss, the frost bombs that come out do not immediately start doing damage now, which is very good, especially for those classes that are pretty weak and don't have a ton of defensives. They have 2 seconds before they're able to move out, before they really start taking damage, and that's very good for Tyrannical weeks. The third boss is pretty free at this point. I don't think I've ever wiped on that boss. And the other nerf with the timer was increased by a minute and 30 seconds, which just kind of makes it where you're not stressing for time as much, and there's a little bit more room for error, at least on the lower end of keys. Since you get super high in keys, there's not really much room for error on most keys unless you're absolutely pumped. But I think this key right now, I enjoy it. It has a lot of pad, but it also has its bosses, which are, I believe, all single target except the first boss. There's some AoE in it. So I think that's a good mixture. I think difficulty wise, it's honestly one of the easier keys. On Tyrannical, I've two chested it on a 21 so far. I obviously want to go higher, but I think it is not. It's not completely free. A lot of groups still mess it up. They're not super good at it. But if you have the right group, I think it's a pretty free key and it's very timeable. I don't think it's a difficult key, really, especially if you're with the right group and you just know what you're doing. I feel like it's a really easy key. That's just my opinion. I honestly, maybe a little bit of a hot take. I said this before, but I think Azure Vault is maybe a more free timer than Court of Stars. Court of Stars timer for me has always been really tight. Unfortified and Tyrannical, it's always really scary. So for me, I'm gonna put Azure Vault at, I want to say S tier, but I feel like a lot of people aren't gonna like that. But honestly, I really don't care. I'm putting it on the S tier, and that's simply because I think it is a really easy key. Especially at this point in the season, now that people know their routes and they know what they're doing. For most groups, I think it's an S tier key, difficulty wise, and I really enjoy the key. It doesn't take nearly as long as it used to, and it's not that bad. So moving on to the next key, go to Court of Stars. So this may be another really hot take, but I know there is people in my guild that 100% agree with me. This key is boring as shit. This key is not fun. I've done this key so many times this season on multiple characters. I'm just done with it. Like, there's just so many things about it that are really annoying. First of all, I know this is considered one of the quote unquote free keys of the season, and granted, it is the key besides Shadow Moon that has been timed probably the most. Um, but for higher keys going like 22 and higher, the timer has been always really tight for me within like 2 minutes, which I feel is really, really tight. Granted, for like a super high key, that's probably plenty of time. But for lower keys, like 22, 21, even 20s, timer's been really tight. I don't know if it's just member groups or what it is. Granted, I've timed them, but it's been tight. It's not difficult, right? So that gives it some leeway for a higher rating because it's definitely not difficult, but it's not forgiving. Like if you wipe on any boss, certainly even on fortified, the key is probably over. Granted, bosses aren't really an issue. I don't think I've ever wiped on a boss. Maybe at the beginning of the season on a last boss when that was a little overtuned, but there's just so much trash and RNG in the dungeon. Like if you don't get the right buffs or quote unquote good buffs or good skips, stuff like that. One of my favorite and easiest things to do, I think, which really helps speed up the key, is the trap that the hunter can activate for the third mini boss, and that really helps speed up the key a lot. It increases like the damage to the ad or mini boss by 30% or something, which is significant. Especially because I believe they do scale with fortified. Another thing I really don't like though is the mini bosses count as bosses, meaning that if you do die, you cannot release, which I really, really do not like. Especially because, like I said, they scale with fortified. They even scale with like trash affixes, so like raging, bolstering, fightful. I believe well, I guess everything scales with explosive, but either way, so they scale with the affixes of trash. So for me, that really doesn't make any sense. I really don't like that. Um, so fun wise, I don't really like it that much because of multiple reasons. Another reason is, like I said, I've done it so many times, and I just don't want to do it again. And the trees, the fucking trees, man, they're so annoying. They're always in the way. As a melee class, like when I'm playing on my monk, it's super annoying that I have to scroll in my mouse wheel just to freaking see everything, and I just really don't like it. I'm just over the key. I get it, it's definitely one of the easier keys, but for fun, it's not that fun. So I'm gonna put it at a B, ahead of Academy, but like it's really not that great of a key for me. I'm sorry about ranting on about Quarter Stars so much, but for me, I'm just over it at this point in the season, and I think a lot of people can agree with that, but I think a lot of people might disagree with that as well. Calls of Valor. This is another hot take, I would say. I really, really want to put it at S tier, but I know that I will get shit on for that. I know that people are absolutely not gonna like that take. Let me explain some of my reasons why. At the beginning of the season, it was another one of those keys that were pretty difficult, but this key actually got a ton of nerfs compared to Azure Ball, right? This key was nerfed multiple, multiple times. There's so many nerfs. Right now, I think it's more difficult on Tyrannical for sure. It's because the bosses, I don't know if they're overtuned. I mean, maybe slightly, but there is a couple bosses. I mean, it's really only two bosses that are pretty difficult and just truck, and you need a healer that is really, really good and strong. Um, First boss being what's her name? Second boss on the left side. I can't think of her name at the moment. The one that does like the Eye of the Storm and then Sanctify. Like that really, really hurts on Tyrannical. And then the Wolf as well. I also can't think of his name at the moment. But the claw bleed that goes out really hurts as well. I'm pretty sure on Tyrannical, if you're missing one person in the soak, that you just die more than likely unless it's like really low key. But anyways, so those are really the only two issues in this dungeon, I would say at the moment. Most things are pretty easy. The first boss, there's only one thing that hurts. The Horn of Valor goes out, and you just survive that, and there's nothing else that does damage as long as you don't get struck down by the dragons that come. But I feel like the trash is honestly really easy. There's no trash that is hard at this point in the season and that dungeon. The trash is really easy. Even unfortified, most of the pulls are pretty massive, and sometimes on my hunter, I'll even tend to run light ammo just because we're doing those massive pulls, and it kind of works out. Um, yeah, it's, the main thing about halls is having the interrupts and stuns just to make sure nothing really goes off. There's only like two or three abilities that can't go off that will really hurt. One of those abilities is Etch. If that goes off, it probably will kill somebody. And the other is the Rune. But even if the Rune goes off, like if you don't have the interrupts, you can let Rune go off and the tank just has to move the ads. That's really the only like things I can think of that really hurt in that dungeon. Um, yeah, trash really isn't an issue, even unfortified. And I really think it's a fun key. I really do. I really like the massive pulls. Most of the bosses are pretty fun, except when they're hurting really bad. I think they're still fun, but they just, it's, you know, very close, and sometimes it gets a little scary. But I really do think Halls is a fun key. Difficulty wise, I don't think it's super hard if you have a good healer at least. I think that's the main thing in that key is having a healer that is able to keep everyone alive for the bosses. Besides that, it's, like I said, really not that hard of a key. I'm gonna put it at A tier, although I want to put it at S tier. I know that a lot of people really do not like that key, but I know a lot of people also do agree with me that it's a really fun key. It's not super difficult, and it's pretty fun. I really do enjoy Halls, and it's, I guess, another hot take I kind of have, but it is what it is. Let's go on to No Code. Oh, No Code. So I have mixed feelings about No Code. The only thing I really like and enjoy about No Code is the massive pulls, right? There is a lot of padding and a lot of AoE. It's basically the whole dungeon. Every pack is probably 7+ mobs for the most part, except for the second area. Some of the packs are like 4 to 5, not super massive pulls. But the first area and the third area is massive pulls. So another thing about this dungeon is this is moving on to things I really don't like. Last two bosses are pretty rough. Tyrannical, they're like I said, pretty rough. Third boss is I really do not like the third boss. Really the only thing difficult about the third boss is I forget what the ability is called, but it's when the tornadoes come out, they nearly one-shot me, and that's really annoying. Um, and turtle doesn't even work. Like if I'm turtled as my hunter, it still does damage, which is insane to me. Even like pre-turtling, it's like okay, that shouldn't happen, but it is what it is, I guess. Last boss isn't horrible. I mean, it's not great, obviously, but I don't know. I feel like you kind of need a prop paladin or a blood DK or a DK in general just to group up the mobs easier, and prop paladin for the interrupts, and you'll be fine. But if you don't have any of that, it's gonna hurt and it's gonna be pretty bad unless you just have another way to gather them easy, I guess. But the main issue I would say in this dungeon is the last two bosses and the timer. It's a very long timer, and you need so much trash. It's just, I think what needs to be done is that the timer needs to be reduced to 30 minutes. And hear me out. I think it's a 40-minute timer, and no one likes those 40+ minute timers. Those are really bad. Make it a 30-minute timer, but also reduce the amount of trash needed by like a significant amount. Um, and I think that would help the dungeon be a lot better. For that, I'm gonna put this at C tier because, like I said, first two bosses are fairly fine, and the padding and the trash is pretty fine, unfortified and tyrannical. But the length of it and some of the tuning on certain things is really bad for me personally, I think, and a lot of other people I think would agree. Especially on the timer. I know a lot of people do not like the timer, so for that, I'm putting it at C tier. Ruby life pools. So I don't really mind Ruby life pools that much. I think it's not the best dungeon, obviously, but it's not the worst either. And I think some people may agree with that, others may not. And at the beginning of the season, it was another one of those keys that were really bad. It was a very, very tough fortified key, and this is actually one of those dungeons that is an exception where it was very difficult on fortified, whereas most of these other dungeons were nerfed because they were difficult on tyrannical. Academy had been nerfed a few times. The tree boss was one of those problem bosses at the beginning of the expansion, and so were the bosses in halls and even Azure Vault. So, like I said, a lot of the problems were with tyrannical, and Ruby was one of those that had issues in fortified. So the trash was nerfed. So at this point, and I haven't said this already, I'm rating this at the current point in the season. So right now, I think Ruby isn't that bad, even on fortified. Also, a lot of things also depend on the week and the affixes, but I think Ruby difficulty wise it is a tight timer, especially if you have some deaths, and if you wipe, it's even closer. Just depends on the key level as well. But for me, I enjoy Ruby to an extent. It's not like I'm having a blast, but I do like it. I don't absolutely hate it. If someone's like, "Hey, want to run a Ruby?" I'm like, "No, I'm not ever touching that key ever again." It's like, "Yeah, sure, I'll run a Ruby. Why not?" But I think it's probably the top of the B tiers for me, and a lot of other people would probably agree. Um, the Ruby is definitely like top of the B tiers, Court next, and then Academy is probably the worst B tier. Difficulty wise, like I said, Ruby is not super difficult at this point in the season with the trash nerfs. You just need a good healer on Fortified. It's just another one of those dungeons where if you don't have a good healer, you're probably going to die to certain things that you shouldn't be dying to. Um, and I think for Tyrannical, it's still somewhat difficult because of the last boss, and the first boss hurts a lot as well. But it's not incredibly difficult, and I don't really have too much to say about it really, except it's not incredibly difficult, and it's not extremely boring or extremely fun either. It's just kind of those one of those keys that are in the middle for me, and I think a lot of people as well. I'm moving on to Shadow Moon. Um, Difficulty obviously S tier. It's very very easy. Everything is super undertuned, and I know it sounds like I might be being sarcastic, but this is honestly just a very free key. I honestly don't think I ever failed a Shadow Moon, even above a 20. I mean, even the 23 I did, where a priest had like 55k DPS, we had like 23 deaths or something. Um, don't judge, it was a really bad group. We still timed it. It was by 7 seconds, but we timed it. It's so free. Um, the only issue you may have is unfortified if you don't have AoE stuns and interrupts, but even then, you're probably gonna time it. To be honest, it's very very easy. The only issue with this dungeon is the third boss, but I think it's fair that the boss takes forever simply because of how easy the dungeon is. So I think that's fair enough. So difficulty wise, easiest key ever to exist. Fun wise, it is not that fun for me anymore because of how many times I've done it. I think I speak for a lot of people when I say this was the key. If they just didn't feel like doing keys that week or pushing IO, they said, "All right, I'm just gonna do Shadow Moons or a Shadow Moon for my weekly vault and call it a day." So I think people are probably bored of Shadow Moon at this point. Um, so I'm gonna say S tier just because it's so easy and it's free IO for anybody basically, unless you already have it at a super high key. Although right now it's not extremely fun, I would say it's really easy, which kind of makes up for the fun part of it. Although you may not want to do it at this point in the season because you've done it so many times, like me and a lot of other people I know. Still gonna go with S tier. I guess I kind of have to put it ahead of Azure Vault just because of how easy it is. But enough of that. All right, Temple. Temple. Oh man, this key is something else. Temple, temple, temple. So the first pack of trash, I really do not like. On Fortified, I know a lot of people have been doing double elemental with Lust, which makes sense. It works out pretty well, although it can one shot you, depending on the key level. But man, Temple, kind of like gather my thoughts on this dungeon because it's not a great dungeon, and I really do have a lot of gripes about it. So for this dungeon, you definitely need a lot of AoE interrupts and AoE stuns and interrupts in general. There's a lot of things that just simply cannot go off while you're dead. Um, in the second room, before a second boss, when you go upstairs, you have the fish that if that ability goes off, the tank gets put to sleep. You have the Shaws that will fear everybody. There's like 4 or 5 throughout the dungeon that need to be interrupted. Granted, most of the time it's not an issue. The Mistweavers need to be interrupted, otherwise they one-shot you. It's like Defiling Mist, I believe, is the ability. Um, so there's definitely like a lot of interrupts that just have to be interrupted and AoE stunned, or you just die, or somebody dies, or you wipe. The timer is very, very tight. You basically cannot wipe, or that key is over unless you're absolutely blasting the damage. You cannot afford to wipe at any key level. It's very tight. Another thing I don't like is you need to kill every single bit of the trash practically. There is the one skip because you can go to the left side of the third boss room and pull trash from there, but it's literally the only skip you can do. So for that, I really think that is not good that there's no skips essentially. Also, Temple has had so many bugs this season. It made a lot of weeks very difficult and not fun to do because they were bugged. Perfect example, last week had 2 bugs. I believe one of them is still currently not fixed. That being the third boss, you had to fight in both forms with all mechanics. In the first boss, the frontal was not visually happening, although it was still happening, so you could be killed by it, even though it didn't look like the beam was moving. So that caused a lot of issues. So difficulty-wise, I think Temple is pretty difficult, very tight timer. You cannot wipe. First boss overlaps, absolutely trash. The overlaps in the first boss are freaking terrible. I cannot stand them. I complain about them all the time. You get the circle that needs to go out. You get thundering. You get the beam. It's so bad. Always, every single time, no matter if it's fortified or tyrannical, someone always dies to the like the waters that come up. Even if they have the weak aura, it happens to me a lot. I don't die every time, but it does happen sometimes. It's really annoying, and it only really happens to me when there's the overlap, and it's just really frustrating when that does happen. I don't really find it super fun. There's not a ton of pad and cleaving because you have to pull fairly small, just because a lot of the trash really hurts. It even hurts the tank a lot, so you can't pull super big. The only big pull in that dungeon is the last pack, and a lot of times you lust it. Except for Tyrannical, it's probably better to lust the last boss, just depending on the key level. Not really sure what they do in super high keys. But I want to get this video to an end, stop rambling on about how bad Temple is. So I'm just going to put Temple at a D tier. It's a pretty difficult dungeon, not a lot of time to play with, and it's not a lot of fun. So this is my tier list. Just a quick recap. Shadow Moon is S tier because it's a very free key. Although it's not super fun at this point in the season, it was pretty fun at the beginning, super free. Azural's S tier because it's very fun, and right now I feel like it's very free, especially if the tank does a good route and everyone knows what they're doing. Halls I put at A tier, even though I really wanted to put it at S tier. Put it at A tier because I really enjoy it. The bosses aren't super bad, even though they're the main issue in that dungeon. They're not super bad, and the trash is pretty easy, no matter if you're unfortified or Tyrannical. Ruby, it's one of those keys that was difficult, not super difficult, but not super hard at this point. So it's top of the B tier for me. Port of Stars, it's at B tier, not A or S tier, because it's not super fun at this point in the season. A lot of things are kind of annoying about it. Super tight timer. The trees are always getting in the way, and a lot of other shit as well that I explained earlier in the video. So B tier, middle of B tier for me. Academy. Some things definitely still need nerfed. Not a extremely hard key, but definitely not a great key for pushing. No Nokud, super long timer. Bosses are kind of mid tier, especially the last 2 are pretty annoying on Tyrannical. Too much trash and too long of a timer, so it's C tier for me. And then Temple, just super tight timer. It's been bugged a lot, and there's been a lot of issues in this dungeon throughout the season, so I'm gonna go with D tier. Let me know what you guys think of this tier list. And I know it's been a super long video, about 25 minutes now. But let me know if you guys agree or what you think I should change or why you would change something. Curious what people think in the comments down below, whether I should move some stuff around or what you guys think about these dungeons, and if you totally agree and say, yeah, this is definitely the spot that these dungeons are in for you, or if you think I should change some stuff, just let me know down below, and give the video a like, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you all for watching. I do apologize for it being a super long video, but I kind of wanted to just get my thoughts out there about each dungeon and find out what other people think. Thanks for watching.